Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Oxford and the Oxford Seminars in Cartography. My name is Nick Millee. I'm the map curator here at the Bodleian Library, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our latest seminar. Before we begin tonight's proceedings, though, it's always good to announce forthcoming events, and the regular events which we normally publicise at this time of the year have finished their programmes for this year. So our colleagues from Maps and Society at the Warburg Institute in London, they'll be back in the next academic year, as will be the Cambridge History in Cartography seminar series. We, however, keep on going. And after tonight, we have one more seminar in this academic year. And that will be a fortnight today on the 12th of June when Jean-Marc Besse of l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris will be talking to us about geography and Catholic censorship in Europe at the end of the 16th century. So that's one to look forward to. If you haven't booked in for that one yet, just book him through the usual channels via the website. I think Stuart, my colleague, has put the details up in the chat. Also, as we go along tonight, please put your questions in the Q&A as we go along, and I'll be monitoring that. And once the seminar is finished, then we'll have a chance to ask Petter hopefully plenty of questions, which brings me very rapidly on to tonight's seminar, Unmapping Africa in the Age of the Enlightenment. Our speaker tonight is Petter Hellström. He's a historian of science and researcher at Uppsala University in Sweden. He was first educated in England at the universities of London and Cambridge before moving back to Sweden, where in 2019 he completed his PhD in his current department at Uppsala. Since 2022, he's the principal investigator of Unmapping Africa, Enlightenment Geography, and the Making of Blank Spaces, which is funded by a grant from the Riksbankens Jubileumsfond. Though his historical interests are wide-ranging, in his work he's largely concerned with the visual culture of science and especially the productive role of images, models, diagrams, maps, and conceptualizations of natural order, social hierarchy, and racial difference. Petter has been a visiting researcher at the Universities of Cambridge and Lucerne, at the EHESS in Paris, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. In his current project, he's collaborating closely with colleagues at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and also at the University of Erfurt in Germany. So with that, Petter, it's over to you. We're very much looking forward to your talk this evening. So good luck.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for this kind introduction and also more generally for inviting and for having me here. As Nick said, my name is Petter Hellström. I'm the principal investigator of Unmapping Africa. And let me start my slideshow. And can you all see it? No.
Not yet.
I need to share it.
Share screen, yeah.
Isn't that the case?
Yeah.
So,
looking good?
Great.
Yeah.
On that note, so as I said, and as Nick said before me, I'm the principal investigator of Unmapping Africa, Enlightenment Geography and the Making of Blank Spaces. And in this project, I am trying to make sense of the large-scale appearance in the course of the 18th century of unmapped blank spaces on European maps of Africa. Now, leaving parts of a map in white to represent unknown or poorly known regions was not a novelty of the time. as Alfred Hyatt, Carla Louise, and others have shown. And much less, of course, was it D'Anville's innovation. And D'Anville is the man for the day. The appearance of blank, unmapped spaces in Africa's interior in the Age of Reason is nevertheless a remarkable development. In contrast to the territories of the New World, which had begun as fully unmapped and unknown to the Europeans, and which still had blank spaces in the 18th century, by the way, Africa's interior had been mapped for centuries. From the 16th century and up until the end of the 17th, there were no coherent blank spaces in Africa's interior. My project then is not so much about the blank spaces as such as about their making. It is really about the unmapping of previously mapped space. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, and I wouldn't choose any other dictionary for tonight, unmapped is an adjective denoting an uncharted, unexplored, or not yet mapped region. Employments of this term are attested from the early 19th century, with figurative uses dating back at least to 1876. 1876, when George Eliot asserted in Daniel Deronda that, quote, there is a great deal of unmapped country within us. Now, Eliot's use of this expression rests upon a conventional separation between map and territory, between signifier and signified. The unmapped country is out there, or in there. It just has not been mapped yet. Because of this final yet, the metaphor implies a progressive notion of exploration. Knowledge can grow, blank spaces can be filled in. In this conception, every map is born as a blank slate, or perhaps as a clean sheet. The realities of historical geography are, however, a bit messier than that. From the Middle Ages, if not earlier, Europeans had left part of their maps empty to represent unknown or poorly known regions. Maps have generally become more detailed over time, but the development has not been straightforward, and there are many examples of this. Now, if the outcome of such processes are unmapped spaces, then I suggest we speak of the process producing such outcomes as unmapping. And how are we to make sense of this? In 1749, Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville erased the world. This is the first sentence of Siobhan Carroll's study of the British imperial imagination, an empire of air and water. The world d'Anville had erased was, more specifically, an African world. D'Anville, a French royal geographer, has long been regarded as the prime mover behind a new convention for the European mapping of Africa, which saw the large-scale suppression and of information and the appearance of unmapped blank spaces defining much of the continent's interior. Yet the overwhelming emptiness of his 1749 map of Africa is without or was without precedent, and it would shape cartographic representations of the continent for generations to come. As Jonathan Sorday put it in a recent study, after D'Anville had stripped Africa's interior bare in 1749, it would remain as such until the mid-19th century. In a field long defined by the gradual accumulation of knowledge, the visual impact of removing previously mapped features was striking. To appreciate what this change looked like, we can juxtapose 3 continental maps of Africa, all of which were produced by French royal cartographers or geographers, and all of them were printed in Paris. The first one is the continental map of Nicolas Sanson, first published in 1650, where there are no unmapped blank spaces. Some regions are certainly mapped in less detail, but all regions are mapped to some degree. All of the continent is divided into kingdoms and empires. The same is true for Guillaume Delisle's map of the continent, first published in 1700. In preparing this map, Delisle had discarded many of the features previously seen on European maps of Africa, such as the sources of the Nile in Central Africa, which reportedly were found in 2 lakes at the feet of the Moon Mountains. Delisle's map is emptier than that of Sanson's in many places, but it still has no coherent blank spaces. Most of the continent is still divided into kingdoms and empires. This is in contrast to D'Anville's map of the continent, first published, as we have established, in 1749. And here there is a striking difference between mapped and unmapped regions. So beyond the Maghreb, Egypt and Abyssinia in the north, and the regions under European control or influence, the Atlantic Islands, the Senegambia, Portuguese West and East Africa, the Cape Colony, and Madagascar. The interior has, for the most part, been left empty. The main exception to this rule are the scattered rivers, mountains, and towns appearing in the northern interior. And I will say much more about them later. This practice of leaving large portions of the African interior unmapped, which was then consolidated in the second half of the 18th century, has long been rationalized as a byproduct of improved scientific standards. In the European Enlightenment, or so we have been told, geographers drew a sharp line between the known and the unknown, and they purged their maps of decorative elements, unverified information, myth, and legend. A reform that, given the sorry state of knowledge at the time, resulted in largely empty maps. I do not have the time here to give a decent review of the historical literature. I just want to say that almost all historians agreed, at least up until the end of the 20th century, that the unmapped blank spaces on D'Anville's map of Africa were the outcome of a cartographic reform that saw the removal of unauthenticated, uncertain knowledge, which disappeared along with the exotic animals and other decorative elements. I think it is easy to see why this explanation for the emergence of Africa's blank spaces remained attractive for such a long time. It had a benefit of identifying a clear rational principle behind the change and of aligning this principle with already established narratives about the European Enlightenment. Some would say it had the additional benefit of avoiding the rather contentious topic of the entanglements between science and empire, notably the invisibilization of African peoples and societies, precisely at the time when the trade in enslaved Africans was reaching unprecedented levels. But there is also the question of repetition. Understanding the appearance of blank spaces on European maps of Africa as the expected or even natural outcome of improved scientific standards is, in fact, an understanding as old as the blank spaces themselves. In 1750, In a printed advertisement for his then just published map of Africa, Danville himself explained that his map might appear more naked than previously available maps of Africa, but that this was because he had refrained from mapping the continent beyond the limits of the known. Mapping poorly known lands, he argued, would only put false ideas in the minds of less informed readers. Danville pushed comparable arguments in other venues. In an essay dedicated to the course of the Nile, for example, and we will return to this essay later, he argued that the sources of the Nile were still unknown, but he concluded that the destruction of false opinions, even when there was nothing better to place in their stead, was an important means with which to advance the progress of our knowledge. Danville's self-understanding was turned into history already by his contemporaries. Because he was a member of 2 royal academies, he was also the recipient of 2 academic eulogies. In the proceedings of the French Royal Academy of Sciences, the mathematician and philosopher Nicolas de Condorcet explained that the vast spaces in white on Danville's maps not only pointed readers to what remained to be known, but that they also testified to the exactitude of all that had been filled in. In the proceedings of the French Academy of Letters, the historian Bon-Joseph Dacier claimed for his part that Danville had refrained from mapping any feature whose geographical location he could not establish with some degree of precision, even if he knew they existed somewhere. This, Dacier claimed, was the reason behind the large empty spaces on Danville's maps, and especially on those of Africa. For this reason, the unmapped blank spaces not only testify to Danville's rigorous accuracy, but they also marked the limits of positive knowledge. Now, the late historian of cartography, Brian Harley, is known for theorizing blank spaces on maps as silences or active omissions. In a series of essays, he argued that the colonial English maps of New England, to extent that they remained what he called silent regarding the Native American population, not only negated indigenous presence in and thus rights to the territory, but that they also encouraged colonial settlement to fill the apparent void. Following Harley's intervention, historians started to look at the blank spaces of Africa in a different light. Since 1990s, at least, numerous scholars have approached Africa's blank spaces as instruments of European imperialism. This, however, has not necessarily brought any challenges to the historiography. A more common solution has in fact been to reaffirm that Africa's blank spaces were indeed the outcome of improved scientific standards, while at the same time lamenting that they made Africans and their societies invisible and that they incentivized European expansion. So it is possible then, it seems, to combine celebratory and critical perspectives, or for that matter, I guess, modernism and postmodernism. Harley then invited us to see the blank spaces as the outcome of human agency, and more specifically as the outcome of human choice. But the window of opportunity can, of course, be more or less open. If map makers in 17th century Europe set out to map the newly spotted coast of Australia, for example, then it was hardly an option to map the continent's interior in any great detail. In that case, the interior would be left unmapped in the passive sense of that term, as in still unmapped. But I think that the term unmapping can also be used in a more active sense. So in human geography, it has occasionally been used to denote an operation meant to unmask and undermine oppressive power relations. I think we can use the term in a much more literal sense. I suggest we use it to denote the suppression of previously mapped data on maps. And I do not know of any more striking example of this phenomenon, unmapping of Africa. Along with Europe and Asia, Europeans had long conceived of Africa as a part of the Old World. The northern regions of the continent had been mapped by Europeans since antiquity, while the more southern parts had been mapped in ever-increasing detail from the late 15th century onwards. So in my ongoing research, I investigate this unmapping of Africa. And of all the actors I follow, Jean-Baptiste Danville is perhaps the most rewarding one to study. Because Danville argued eloquently for his methodological choices and left numerous traces in the historical archives more generally, it is possible, at least to some degree, to establish on what grounds he mapped or unmapped specific features. Or in other words, it's possible to establish whom he trusted and whom he did not trust. Reading Danville's maps in light of his printed memoirs, his research library, and his map collection, I thus try to establish precisely this: what information he trusted and what he distrusted, and, if possible, on what grounds. In doing so, I'm very grateful to be able to draw upon the work of a number of other scholars, notably Junia Furtado, who has demonstrated Danville's heavy reliance on Portuguese sources, and Lucille Aguet, who has worked extensively on Danville's mapping of Egypt. So at this point of the presentation, I think it will not come as a big surprise if I tell you that the choices shaping Danville's map of Africa seem to have been less coherent and less principled than most histories of Africa's map would have it. In the more recent literature, this is interestingly often acknowledged, although it's also downplayed, or the importance of this is being downplayed. One, I think, very instructive example of this is Francesc Relagno's book, The Shaping of Africa, where he writes that, I quote, Danville showed in his map a sharp contrast between rather well-known regions such as the Mediterranean coast, the Congo, Abyssinia, and Monomotapa, which he recorded with thick nomenclature, and vast unknown areas inland, which are completely devoid of toponymy. It would seem that Danville engraved only the place names whose existence he considered to be certain, leaving the rest blank until factual knowledge would allow further geographical details to be included with enough confidence. And here you see the traditional, typical kind of historical narrative, which has been around since the 18th century. But having repeated this established narrative, Relagno adds, rather as an afterthought, that Danville nevertheless retained a number of what he calls enduring misconceptions in the African interior, including, I cite, the Ptolemaic idea of a pair of twin lakes with regard to the sources of the Nile. And Relagno also then notes that the depiction of the Niger shows, quote, no outlet into the Atlantic Ocean. So in the remaining part of my presentation, I want to think about this observation on Relagno's part, which I think is much more important than Relagno acknowledges. And one possible way to begin is to have a look at what is at the map, of course. So resorting to old and mainly written sources to try to establish the distribution of rivers, mountains, and towns in the interior of Africa is clearly a hard task, especially if you are known never to have been outside of the Paris region. Now, this is Danville's mapping of the Nile and the Niger. Now, we can compare this to a present-day map of African river systems. As you can see, there is little overlap. Now, this exercise is not meant, and I really mean this, it's not meant to pass judgment on his work. It's only to say that he had exactly the same difficulties as anyone else at the time. But it's also to say that this did not stop him from committing rivers to the map and locating them in regions unvisited at the time by any European. There is something odd here with the description of what happened as compared to what happened. And I think that one way to move ahead is to think about on whose authority he mapped rivers in the African interior. So let us begin with Danville's mapping of the Nile, whose sources he identified in two lakes in Central Africa, located at the feet of the legendary Moon Mountains. Now, the origins of the myth of these two mountains are not entirely clear, but this geographical idea predates Ptolemy, and it appears that Ptolemy took it from Marinus of Tyre, who in turn cites a Greek traveler named Diogenes. So it has been even also suggested, I should say, that this account of the Moon Mountains was actually not in Ptolemy's own writings, but it might have been added after his death. In any case, the Moon Mountains entered European maps following the translation of Ptolemy, and they then kept moving around on the maps in the African interior. And really, they were sitting in all sorts of places until in the 16th century, they sort of stabilized and were generally located in the continent's southern interior. Now, the Moon Mountains and the two Nile lakes fed, which were fed by the melting snow of the mountains and then gave rise to the Nile. This was a feature that had been suppressed by Vincenzo Coronelli, Guillaume Delisle, and other respected geographers from the late 17th century onwards, so in the one or two generations before Danville. And they had been suppressed precisely on the grounds that their existence could not be verified and that no European had seen them or no trustworthy person. So located on Danville's map, in the middle of the continent, surrounded on all sides by unmapped blank spaces indicating that this territory was still unknown, is pretty significant because it means that Danville actually was not removing but reintroducing the sources of the Nile. And he was doing so with stated reference to Greek and Arab geographers, explaining in this printed note here in the empty region just west of the Moon Mountains, that we ought not entirely reject the reports of Ptolemy, El-Idrisi, and Abul Fida, for as long as there's nothing better to place in their stead. Even further west, Danville mapped the Niger River with stated reference also, or again, to Greek and Arab authorities, citing El-Idrisi, Leo Africanus, and Ptolemy in a printed note, in a note printed directly onto the map. And you can see here is the rest of the references. Now, as Jean-Charles Dussen has noted, Donville, in fact, relied to a greater degree on Arab geography than any European geographer before him. And he did so, or one reason why he did so was because of accumulation or availability. The number of Arabic manuscripts available to European scholars had multiplied since the 17th century in particular, but then again in the 18th century. So as Donville was preparing his map of Africa, he had access to more manuscripts, or his generation had access to more manuscript than any previous one. The Arabic sources contain lots of new information. For the most part, Donville relied on the Oriental sources without any explicit reference onto the map. But here, as you can see, in the éclaircissement géographique de la carte de l'Inde, for example, he massively cites the same Abul Fida, as well as El-Idrisi and a few other Arab geographers, but he only references them in his writing, not directly onto the map. And his maps of Africa in this respect are an exception. Both his regional maps of Africa produced in 1727 and his continental map of Africa, the one we are looking at now, they have the references printed directly onto the maps. So we know also, I mean, we for example, we know thanks to Lucie Laguet that Donville had some of these books in his libraries. For example, El-Idrisi's Geographia Nubiensis, the translation. And in any case, what I did, and what I'm going to show you now, is I basically tried to test the hypothesis of what had been suggested to me by Dussen and Tolias and others. So I went to the printed memoirs, and Donville did this as a rule. Whenever he published a major map, he also published a memoir or an essay explaining why he had written this the way he did. And sometimes he picked up on specific geographical questions. And for Africa, the two really big questions of debate at the time were the sources of the Nile and the river systems of Northern Africa more generally, in particularly then whether the Senegal and the Gambia were connected to the Niger and the course of the Niger. So here are two printed memoirs from 1759 in which he discusses all the information available to him and how he has dealt with it, whether he has trusted it or not. I approached this in a very unsophisticated quantitative matter. Reading the memoirs, I realized that he is really drawing upon a lot of different sources. There are the Greek and Roman authors and authorities. There are the Arab authors and authorities that are available to him in translation. And this is important because he reads Greek and Latin, but he does not read any Oriental language. Then there are the European authors and authorities, so the contemporary or more contemporary Europeans. And then in the fourth category, I put African and Near Eastern informants. And when you count these people, you realize that he's very well read on ancient geography, and he's depending massively on Ptolemy in particular. So his most heavily cited authors are all ancient. They are not modern. The second most cited group of authorities are Arab authors, Arab geographers, and in particular El-Idrisi. The third most cited group that he relies on are contemporary Europeans or more contemporary Europeans. So you can see that this is actually only coming in as number 3 and not as being a very major source for him, but he does draw upon them as well. And then of course his least cited group of sources are actually people who are either locals or who have information through locals by some way or another. And here you can see that many of them don't actually have names. So although Donville has long been cherished for initiating a new and supposedly modern era in the history of cartography, Donville was in fact relying more heavily on ancient and medieval sources than any of his predecessors. And as Relanyu, I think, correctly notes, he says that Donville must be considered as one of the greatest cartographers among those adhering to the Renaissance pattern of mapmaking, but by no means as a forerunner of the new scientific era. This resonates also with claims by the historian of geography Geoffrey Stone, who claimed then that the Age of Reason did not bring about any revolution in the mapping of Africa. Instead, there was remarkable methodological continuity during the entire pre-colonial period, so up until the late 19th century. In Stone's view, the more important shift happened much later, or during what he calls the recent and short-lived aberration in the otherwise long-standing imperial relationship between Africa and Europe, namely colonialism. So, as Stone correctly points out, in the 18th century, there was almost no new information about the African interior available to Europeans. And this clearly did not stop the map from evolving. Stone writes, the long-standing, if sparse delineation of the interior began to be removed with little or nothing inserted in its place. With hindsight, whether this constituted an improvement or a deterioration is debatable. And now, with the expert help of my colleague Yun Yang, a research engineer at Uppsala University, I have tried to settle this debate for you by comparing different renditions of the Nile. Oh, sorry, I should have shown this earlier. This is the compilation of the most cited authors and authorities by Donville for his mapping of the Nile and the Niger. And as you can see, there is no contemporary qualifying into this list. It's all of it is, I mean, the most contemporary source is Al-Hassan al-Wazan, so commonly known as Leo Africanus. I might come back to that slate later. Here is a maps prepared to you by Yun. And here you can see the evolving representations of the Nile and the sources of the Nile. And I leave it to you to say, to decide whether the representations are improving over time or not. I think it's not entirely clear. And there's no reason to think it would have been, it would have been clear because no new information has come out. Every geographer from Hondius up to Donville has basically more or less has access to the same information. They've tried their best from reading ancient and medieval sources. They've tried their best to come as close to reality as they can. And we can do the same for the Niger. And again, it's not entirely clear here either whether the map with respect to the Niger is getting better or not. So how are we doing with time? Great. So in the absence of any decisive reports settling or sort of any clear reports really deciding where the rivers are, where the sources are, European geographers kept moving the rivers around in the African interior. Um, and in this way, it's perhaps better also to think of Donville as precisely as Relanius suggested, as belonging to the earlier generation of making maps. In fact, even Condorcet, who styled him as like the great hero of cartography who revolutionized the field, Condorcet still also said that Donville, quote, knew very little about geometry and even less about astronomy. And instead, he said Donville worked very much like a scholar or érudit. He said that Donville worked like a philologer and a historian, and that was his approach to mapping. So there really is nothing new about Donville's working method, unless perhaps one could claim or make a claim that, in fact, the new thing about them is that they are older. Like his working method is less modern than the generation before him. So, in this, if this then is the case, how are we to explain the overwhelming emptiness of so many regions in Donville's map of Africa? One way to look for an explanation, I would think, is to look to the regions of which Greek and Arab geographers had little or nothing to report. And one such region was the lands to the north of the Gulf of Guinea, known at the time as the Slave Coast. So this is the rendition of this region by Delisle, who was dominated French geography in the generation before Donville. By the mid 18th century, when Donville produced his map, it is estimated that somewhere between 1 and 2 million Africans had been kidnapped from this area and loaded onto European ships in the ports, only in the ports you can see on this map. Now, many of them had been brought to the coast from the interior. For over 2 centuries, Europeans had received reports about the geography beyond the coastline, even if they hadn't been there themselves, and they had incorporated this information in their maps. Now, this is the kind of information that disappeared in Donville's rendition of Africa. And as this detail of his map tells you, nothing really happens between the coast until you move up to the region where there are Arab authorities and Greek authorities. Now, if we place Donville's slave coast over that of Delisle, I think we get an idea of what kind of information Donville had suppressed. And thank you very much for your attention. I think I'm going to end here.
Well, thank you very much, Petter. That was a hugely illuminating talk, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions from the audience because there was so much of interest and intrigue raised there. I think your final slide, comparing the two maps, that's the one just showing the extent of the disappearance of the mapped interior of Africa is really striking. And certainly one thing which caught my eye and I found very interesting indeed was where you showed those 8 maps, certainly for the Nile, from Hondius back up to Donville. And I was struck instantly by that image. And you posited the question, does the mapping get any better? And my first look at this was, well, that map at the bottom right, the Hondius one, looks much more similar to the nowadays Hydro Rivers database map than certainly the Donville one anyway. It's a very striking graphic, I thought. So thanks for bringing those to our attention. Fantastic stuff. So one question I'd like to begin with is, from what you've been talking about, what does it all mean? How does it change our understanding of the map of Africa, do you think?
I think, well, this is a huge question, obviously, but the reason I came to this topic is I think it matters, right? So I'm not a historian of cartography by training, and that's not my background. But I think that this story is revealing a lot about the relationship between Europe and Africa, which I think is really what we are trying to understand here. And also to say that that relationship is clear. It's not like traditionally Donville has been made into a hero. Then I think there has been a tendency since the late 19th rather to turn that story upside down and say that he's a villain. He is the one that opened the gates and basically allowed Europeans to dominate. I think, first of all, it's not really clear what Donville is doing from his own point. Like he's doing this a long time before there is any colonial interest of sort of trying to conquer Africa, which is really something that happens a century later. So I don't know. It's something where the sort of scientific ideals and ideas about how to do a map in a good scientific manner will have enormous consequences for the historical development. That's one thing I think we can learn from this. It can have consequences that we do not anticipate at the time. The second thing I think we can really learn from this is the power of narrative. That this strong narrative, which is so attractive because it's like convincing, it's rational, it's also it's a beautiful story about. I mean, one of the guys who really establishes this is your big, I mean, England's big 18th century hero in cartography, James Rennell. And he's the one who introduces this trope about the elephant disappearing. He's the one that first cites Swift to make this point about, like how all these geographers in the past were really bad because they just tried to hide their ignorance. And now here we are, a new generation of scholars, scientific geographers. We remove all this fancy stuff, and what you have is maybe not so much, but you can trust it. So it's really a narrative being established in the 18th century, and it's still around, although it sort of doesn't really fit the data. And the narrative has somehow been more powerful than the empirical data. So in spite of the sort of evidence suggesting that this is not what happened, people keep on repeating it happened. I don't know. To me, this is really sort of very, very fascinating to think about intellectually, because it says something more about the way we understand the past rather than only this story.
Thanks, that's fascinating. What it struck me, were you talking about the removal of the elephant from the map, and my mind is all of a sudden taken to the 1920s and the Gold Coast survey, and there's that 1 inch to 1 mile sheet of somewhere in northwest, what's now Ghana, where the surveyors have drawn an elephant in the form of contour lines, and that survived for 4 or 5 editions until the Survey of Ghana took over the mapping of that part of the world and did it properly. Anyway, that's by the by. Stuart has put some stuff into the chat, which I would
Right?
recommend you have a look at, which is a lot more of what Petra has been doing. And I'd like to thank Vera for a comment in the Q&A, which isn't a question, but a reference to an article discussing blank spaces, which might be useful. Lucille Ajouet, specifying ignorance in 18th century cartography. So have a look at that. She's given the full reference. It's a Brill publication from 2016. I'd like to just start turning now to some of the questions popping up in the Q&A.
Mhm.
This one from Debbie. Do we have any idea how accurate the information was on the earlier maps, such as Delisle's? Was D'Anville right to leave it out?
Um, yes, we can have some idea about that, and it wasn't very accurate. So this again is not, it's not again an easy story. It's not the story that really was sort of a true depiction of African society, and D'Anville just erased it. It's messier, like as actually an Ethiopian colleague of mine pointed out when we were discussing this map in Erfurt, or in Gotha, arranged by the University of Erfurt earlier this spring. He was able to spot that many of the names in what is today Tanzania and Kenya on the earlier maps were in fact places that are in present day Ethiopia. So it seems that one thing that geographers did is they maybe sort of, when they had toponyms, they sort of stretched them out. So I mean, there is some truth. There is some truth to the claims forwarded by D'Anville and others at the time, that there had been sort of some fiddling with the maps and people have tried to hide their ignorance. I think there is some truth to that. But it's also true that D'Anville removed things that really were there. And it's also true that he introduced things that never existed. So it's just a very messy story. I don't think D'Anville's map is more correct or less correct than Delisle's. It's basically, there's much more continuity than you think, apart from the visual presentation. In method, there is not so much. There's actually not very much that happened. They worked the same ways. They all sat at some workshop in central Paris, collecting information that came to them, and then just basically reading it and trying to take an informed guess.
Thank you very much. I think that answers that one quite comprehensively. Another question now from Bertie. Going back earlier than Hondius, have you compared D'Anville's map to the earliest engraved European maps of Africa, those by Livius Anuto in his Geographia dell'Africa from 1588? How did the geographic information of Africa evolve from the 16th century?
Right. So I don't know the particular map mentioned now by Bertie, was it?
Yep.
But there is a shift. Like, so the maps in the early 16th century look different. They are pretty empty in the interior. They actually look more like D'Anville's map. So in the early 18th century, no, early 16th century, what Europeans have access to is really just Ptolemy and a few other ancient authors. So what they do is they map the coast, which they are surveying with their ships, and then they put the Moon Mountains and the Nile and all that into the interior. But apart from that, it's pretty empty. And then there is a shift from the late 16th century, really pushed by Venetian cartographers or cosmographers, where they try to reform the map and try to make use of more recent information and introduce that into the map. And from the late 16th century onwards, the map keeps filling up gradually until D'Anville's reform. So in another presentation I sort of put a map, I put a Waldseemüller map as my final slide, trying to provoke the audience to say that actually, like, there's not such a big difference between Danville's map and Waldseemüller, because it's like really neat coast where things are mapped according to sort of more modern methods, even though of course there's an improvement and there's much more data later on. And then the interior is largely empty apart from ancient geography. But of course, that's what's a provocation. It's not like entirely true. And we know from, for example, then from Junia Furtado's work that Danville has included a lot of information that he has received from his Portuguese collaborators. So there's a lot of detail for Congo, Angola, and what is today Mozambique or Monomotapa at that time.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question from Martin. To what extent do you think that Danville's cartographic choices and choice of sources influence later justifications of colonization? Can you see any direct impacts of the map on later colonial policy?
I think yes, but I would like to qualify that. So, and here, of course, and I like this question because we are not discussing intent, but effect, which I think is more important. So, we cannot, I mean, we know that Danville, okay, I'll say something about intent because normally, so we know that Danville is sort of embedded in the imperial project. Like he's working for the French crown, he's working for the Portuguese crown, he's working for the French East India Company, he's working for the Jesuits as well. So he's basically for hire, and people hire him for their various projects. At the same time, there's nothing clear in what he's writing that he has any particular sort of colonial interests or like that he's promoting any specific agenda. But now to Martin's question, because what we can see is that very quickly people all across Europe take up on Danville's map. It quickly becomes the new golden standard for how to produce a map of Africa. So after 1749, basically reputable geographers reintroduce the sources of the Nile, according to Ptolemy. They draw the Niger according to El Idrisi and the Arab geographers, and they basically clean the entire southern interior. And this will only accelerate, so that as the 18th century ends, the map is emptier than it has ever been, including like it's emptier than it was during Roman antiquity. You know, it's so empty. And at that point, some people start to confuse the map with reality. And this is basically, I think, what Harley wanted us to think about. So Isabelle Suron, who's probably written the most comprehensive study of how Danville's maps and how his geography was taken up by the French Empire. She has noted that James Rennell, reading these maps, thought that they communicated the deeper truth about Africa. He thought that actually, because the map was empty, not because there was poor information or because the information had been suppressed, but because there was no information to have. So he actually is writing in the 1790s or 1780s maybe, and speculating that Africa is largely just empty in the interior. There's nothing there.
Which kind of makes you wonder why there would be a desire to colonize if there's nothing to colonize.
Yeah. Though at that point, there isn't still any strong drive to colonize. There is a strong drive to explore, and there's a strong drive to exploit. So what they want to do at that time is they want the gold, they want the slaves, and they want other kind of resources they can exploit, but Europeans are largely sitting on the coasts and just basically taking everything and shipping it out. They are not so much yet trying to colonize Africa. And this really only happens in the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, when the world is like reconfigured. Britain has lost America, France has lost America, um, and Spain is losing Latin America, and the European sort of colonial eyes are starting to find new places.
Thank you. Moving on, we have a question from Shadong, who says, I'm a James Rennell researcher currently focusing on deserts, and I'm curious about how this landform came to be considered worthy of unique representation. Donville seems to have been very different from the cartographers at that time, and the Sahara suddenly disappeared from his maps. Can you explain what happened? What drove this process?
For the Sahara itself, this is his presentation of the what is of the Niger region. So it's not really Sahara, but it's, oh, should I get a bigger map perhaps here? Well, it's just empty for him, right? So he's clearly using, like, he's labeling, the names are here, the names of different deserts, but yeah, there is no, for example, there is no iconographic representation of emptiness, but a desert seems just to be absence of everything else, as the name suggests. So I would be very happy to know more about this if you would share your work. And because obviously Rennell is massively influenced by Donville. It's his great hero. Rennell is known at the time as the English Donville. So yeah, I would encourage you to look for precedents to the way that Rennell represents desert and thinks about desert in Donville, because there surely must have been some kind of influence, or at least inspiration.
Thank you, Petter. I hope that's inspired our questioner to search further and maybe reach out to you after this
Yeah.
event. Another question from Peter. Isn't there also a question of the nature of knowledge? Is it the case that Donville, in light of the Enlightenment and exclusion of non-purely geographical information from maps, did not think worthy of inclusion the figures of the African rulers, the Arab traders, and the elephants and lions, all shown on Portolan charts, which might perhaps have been relevant for viewers who wanted a deeper understanding?
Now, this is an argument advanced in much of the literature, not much of the literature, but in the more recent refined literature. This discussion is often framed as the suppression of ethnographic knowledge, so that in earlier maps it would actually, like, this is what Rennell was ridiculing, to put an elephant or what he would call a savage. That this is actually information at the time. It's not decoration. But we need to qualify this a little bit, because first of all, if you zoom in on this map, there is a lot of ethnographic information in the text. So even if it's not iconographically represented, Donville still includes information of an ethnographic nature about different peoples and so on. It's just that he's clearly treating them as something different and less advanced than his own society. So whereas earlier maps would treat Africa pretty much in as Europe, divided into kingdoms, empires, regions, with cities and so on. And this would continue in Delil. So you can see also here there are no pictorial representations of animals or peoples. Here, there's much less, and notably, almost no borders. So this is not a political territory. It's more a sort of just a nomadic land where peoples are moving around and they have different, they are seen as tribes, not as nations. They are seen as an uncivilized rather than as kingdoms comparable to European kingdoms. So there is still information here. If you zoom in on anything here, in especially off the coasts, you can see a note, for example, just where Congo-Kinshasa is today, in the middle of southern Africa. That's an ethnographic note, and there are many notes of that kind.
Thank you. Okay, let's move back to deserts. Vera's question. The Gobi Desert in Onville's map is left blank, but not because it is an unknown region, but rather because there is no cartographic symbol for a desert, in contrast to traditional Chinese cartography. And she references Elke Papelitsky's article.
Yeah.
What would you say about Onville's representing Sahara?
Yeah, I'd say that this is probably true. So I think the blank space can mean different things. I mean, this is already established also in earlier research. That's not me speaking, but white space in a map can be that this has not yet been mapped. It can also be that it's but it could also mean that there's nothing there, as in a desert, that a desert is thought about as a void. But it could also mean that there is something there, but it's just not important. I mean, obviously, in a Portolano chart, most of the interior is not mapped because it's not important for navigation. So, yeah, there is a confusion as to the meaning of the white. Sorry, there's a very loud wasp here. Can you hear it?
No,
Good.
no.
And it
All we
doesn't.
can hear is you.
Okay, good. It's a wasp trying to exit the window. Anyway, I'll
Would you
help.
like to remove the wasp?
I'll help the wasp later.
Thank you, Peter. Another question, another one from Martin here. Could the concept of unmapping, as you define it, be applied beyond Africa to other regions or even to modern maps? How can this concept help us understand maps more critically in general?
Well, obviously, like now, this this is my concept, so I like it. I hope someone else can find use in it as well. But I really think it can help us because I think that it might help us to see mapping more in the sense of proposed by Matthew Edney as a process. So there is mapping, there is unmapping. All these processes are running in parallel. Things are being removed, things are being put in, things are being also adjusted and changed without being. And all of that is not like unmapping. Using this concept is a way to acknowledge that information is not only cumulative, it's not only growing, but there is always choices of what to remove that wasn't previously there. And I think that perhaps it's more helpful than silence because it's really about the representation on the map. It's really about the visual, right? And the problem with silence is that it's a metaphor about who is allowed to speak, which we recognize from a lot of post-colonial studies and Spivak's famous essay and so on. But no one is speaking. In cartography, no one is speaking. The only thing you can be is you can be represented or not. And then you can never speak, but you will be interpreted. The signs will be interpreted by others. So I mean, I know of some very striking other example of unmapping. They are not as massive as the unmapping of Africa's interior. So in Carla Louise's book about called Terra Incognita, which was recently translated into English, there is a section about, which is, when I read it, it's really just sort of what I studied for Africa, but she did it for Patagonia. And I didn't know that when I started. And she didn't know about my work. But she tells the story of how Patagonia was mapped until the 19th century and then made empty. So there are other cases of this. Um, and and uh, um, and yeah, I really think that we can use this concept more broadly, not only for creating a whole white space, even if it's not everything turns into a blank space. There could also be sort of unmapping might just be about one city or one village. I think this would perhaps give us words to understand what happens in a lot of conflict zones as well, in geographic, like in conflicts between where things go in or out of the map depending on your perspective in that conflict.
Okay, thank you. One thing that struck me during the last hour or so is that what sort of contribution do you think there's potential for coming out of Africa itself in terms of contemporary research and following your lead, so to speak? Is there any encouragement by or any enthusiasm amongst African scholars to explore this further?
Yeah, I mean, this I think is really probably sort of the most important venue to explore moving ahead, because the way I see it is that my work is mainly, I mean, in a way, I'm sort of taking my cues from D'Honville's own explanation, like his own programmatic explanation that, even this destroying false ideas is also valuable in itself. And I think that my work is primarily critical work, which is about questioning an established historiographical narrative. Then to understand better and to sort of rewrite this story and understand how Africa's map was changing, that's a very complex question, because it's not only that there's the question of exploration and sort of knowledge available to Europeans, and there is also the question of, in exactly the same period, of the rise of scientific racism and sort of institutionalized prejudice. And it's the sort of massive explosion of the slave trade in the second half of the 18th century. But at the same time, there is this reappreciation of Arab and Islamic sources, which sort of D'Honville initiated. It's a very complex, messy story, I think. And one of the most inspiring meetings one of the most inspiring sort of steps I've taken personally since I began this project was a workshop attended by a large cohort of Ethiopian historians in March that I alluded to previously. And this was really, really rewarding in ways that I did not expect. They could relate, although they were not experts of European cartography, they had knowledge about the geography of Africa and the historical geography of Africa and the various kingdoms and political entities that had existed in particularly East Africa. And this sort of massively changed the way I was thinking about this map. And it made me think that what really matters here is trying to establish how where the information came from, no matter like the information that was committed to the map and then perhaps removed, or perhaps it remained. But all this information, where did it come from? I mean, I've been able to find some of the sources in the ancient and the Arabic scripts, but also, I'll try to move quickly through this. And that's the old ones. I mean, this list and this list is really fascinating. Who is this person who had, I mean, from second from the bottom, a person who was in contact with Mr. Maillet in the Levant. Who is this person? Who is Haji Ali, a merchant sent by the emperor of the Abyssinians to Cairo? Who is Barut, this Syrian man, Syrian meaning then a Levantine Christian, attached to the library in Paris? Who is second from the top? Who is the black man who comes from the capital village of the kingdom of Bornu? To me, it would be really interesting to try to see how knowledge traveled from Africa in different localities of Africa to Donville's desk, or to anyone else's desk for that matter, before exploration. So obviously 50 years later, the Europeans start to send big explorations into the interior, but I'm really interested more in the earlier period.
Thanks. Is that very much where you see this work going in the future then?
I mean, that's really where I would like to take it. Yes, I think this really needs to move ahead and make sort of real progress. This would need to become a project, because because the entire thing is really about the relationships of Europe and Africa. I think the project needs to involve both Europeans and Africans to be able to sort of disentangle that story. Otherwise, I think we can only do it halfway.
Excellent. Well, that's clearly given you lots of potential future research and discussion to continue with. And I'm wondering whether there are any more questions from the audience, because I think we've worked you very hard this evening so far, Petra, and you're clearly being intimidated by the wasp at the same time.
Yeah, the wasp is really big.
Is it? This makes it even worse. So unless there are any more questions, and I suspect there are not now, thank you for such an enlightening presentation. You've given us lots to think about, and I'm sure the audience has been thrilled with what they've heard about. And some of the information you presented has been real food for thought. So on behalf of our audience, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to wish everybody a safe journey home, wherever they may be, or if they're at home, just enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully we'll see everybody again in a fortnight's time at the next TOSCA. So just to thank my colleague Stuart for doing all the technical work, and apologies on behalf of my colleague Liz, who couldn't be here tonight, so you've had to put up with a double dose of me. So Petra, thanks ever so much. It's been a real pleasure to have you on board this evening. And with that, I'd like to say good night, good afternoon, or whatever to everybody, and hope to see you all soon. So thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.